Imagine waking up one morning to headlines saying your government just took over a company. Not because it was failing, but because it had suddenly become a matter of national security. That's exactly what just happened in the Netherlands. And this isn't some small local business we're talking about. It's a global chip maker called Nexperia, a company that quietly powers much of Europe's tech and auto industries. Now, here's where it gets even more dramatic. Nexperia isn't just any chip company, it's Chinese-owned. And that fact alone has thrown the Netherlands right into the center of the world's biggest technological tug-of-war between the United States and China. For years, Europe tried to play it neutral. But with this bold move, the Dutch government has drawn a clear red line, taking a side in the global chip war. The Dutch economy minister came forward, calm but firm, explaining that this wasn't about politics or profit. It was about protecting national security. To understand why that matters so much, you need to know what Nexperia actually does. Headquartered in the Netherlands with major production in Germany, Nexperia is a semiconductor powerhouse, valued at more than $50 billion and making over 100 billion chips every single year. These aren't the flashy, high-performance chips that power gaming consoles or AI systems like those from NVIDIA or AMD. Think of Nexperia's products more like the nuts and bolts of modern technology. Simple, reliable, and absolutely everywhere. From smartphones to laptops to electric cars, these small chips are the invisible lifeblood of Europe's tech-driven economy. Especially for the automotive sector, Nexperia is irreplaceable. Without its chips, Europe's dream of mass-producing electric vehicles could stall overnight. So it's not hard to see why this company isn't just another tech firm. It's a strategic asset. But there's another darker side to the story. These chips aren't only used in cars and gadgets, they're dual use, meaning they can also serve military purposes. That became painfully clear in 2023, when Dutch media uncovered that Nexperia chips had found their way into Russian drones, the very same drones bombing Ukraine. This discovery sent shockwaves across Europe. The Netherlands, a strong supporter of Ukraine, had already placed strict sanctions on Russia. Yet somehow, through murky Chinese middlemen, millions of Dutch-made chips ended up helping the Kremlin's war machine. Still, that scandal wasn't what pushed the Dutch government over the edge. The deeper concern lies in who owns Nexperia. Back in 2018, a Chinese company called Wingtech Technology quietly bought it. On paper, it looked like a standard business deal. Everything legal and above board. But here's the twist. Wingtech isn't just any private firm. It's partly state-owned, overseen by China's State-Owned Assets, Supervision and Administration Commission, which essentially means Beijing has a say in how it operates. That connection set off alarm bells in The Hague and Brussels. Because if the Chinese government can influence Wingtech and Wingtech controls Nexperia, then what's stopping Beijing from gaining access to Europe's tech infrastructure? In a world where technology is power, that's not a small risk. It's a potential vulnerability. And this isn't the only chip-related concern the Netherlands has on its hands. Just a few miles away from Nexperia's headquarters stands another Dutch tech titan, ASML, the crown jewel of the global semiconductor world. ASML makes the machines that build the most advanced computer chips on Earth. Without ASML, companies like TSMC, Intel, and Samsung couldn't produce their cutting-edge processors. In other words, if Nexperia provides the building blocks, ASML holds the blueprints to the entire global chip industry. So when the Netherlands decided to seize control of Nexperia, it wasn't acting alone. It was sending a message to the world. Europe is done playing neutral. The continent that once tried to balance between Washington and Beijing is now making it clear where its loyalties lie. Meanwhile, both Wingtech and Beijing have condemned the Dutch move, calling it unfair, politically motivated, and a violation of business norms. But inside Europe, many see it as a long overdue act of defense, a way of taking back control of the technologies that power modern life. For a while, it looked like the Netherlands wasn't too worried. After all, other countries had already sounded the alarm about Chinese investments in their high-tech sectors. Back in 2022, when Nexperia tried to buy the Newport wafer fab in the United Kingdom, a key chip-making plant, the British government stepped in and said, absolutely not. London made it clear, letting a Chinese-owned company take over critical semiconductor infrastructure was a risk to national security. The deal was blocked, and the factory was later sold to an American firm instead. But across the North Sea, the Dutch were still keeping calm. In 2023, even after conducting their own investigation into Nexperia's Chinese ties, officials in The Hague gave the company a green light to purchase a Dutch tech startup. At that time, nothing seemed especially threatening. The government said there were no alarming findings, and life went on. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. On September 30th, the Dutch Ministry of Economic Affairs issued a stunning order. Nexperia was now under national control. The company was told it couldn't touch its own assets, alter its technology, or make changes to its leadership or operations for a full year. The notice hit like a thunderclap. No one saw it coming. The next morning, 3 of Nexperia's top European executives, 2 Dutch and 1 German, rushed to a court in Amsterdam. But here's the twist. They weren't fighting the government's decision. Instead, they filed an appeal to intervene, signaling that something inside the company had gone seriously wrong. Within days, things got even messier. The Chinese chief executive who had been running Nexperia was suspended and stripped of his powers. All of Wingtech's shares, the Chinese parent company's stake, were placed under the control of an unnamed third party. When these details became public on October 12th, it sent shockwaves through both the business world and European politics. After all, this kind of government intervention is rare in a free market economy like the Netherlands. For a Western democracy to step in and effectively seize a private company, that's the kind of move people expect from authoritarian regimes, not from Europe's trade-friendly heartland. So, naturally, everyone was asking the same question. What on earth happened inside Nexperia? The Dutch government didn't give many specifics, but their statement hinted at something serious. Officials said they were acting to protect the continuity and safeguarding of critical technological knowledge and capabilities on Dutch and European soil. In plain terms, they feared the company's most valuable secrets, the designs, data, and production know-how, were at risk of being transferred abroad. Behind the scenes, there were growing whispers that Wingtech might have been trying to quietly move Nexperia's technology or production to China, or worse, funnel its intellectual property to a Chinese competitor. It wasn't just about chips anymore. It was about control of knowledge, the kind that could tip the balance in the global tech race. But this sudden clampdown may not have been purely about Nexperia. Many analysts see it as a move on a much larger chessboard, a geopolitical one. The United States, which has long been pressuring its allies to reduce dependency on China, holds deep influence in the Netherlands through NATO, and Washington has been crystal clear: the West must keep advanced technology out of Beijing's reach. Meanwhile, in Brussels, EU officials were having similar conversations. Countries like Germany, whose car industry depends heavily on Nexperia's chips, had started voicing concerns. If China ever decided to pull strings through Wingtech, Europe's auto supply chain could be thrown into chaos. So, the European Commission began coordinating closely with the Dutch government, and some say it was this pressure from both the US and the EU that finally pushed the Netherlands to act. When the takeover was announced, the legal basis caught many by surprise. The Dutch government had invoked a nearly forgotten law, the Goods Availability Act, written back in 1952 at the height of the Cold War. Originally, it was meant to help the country prepare its economy in case of a conflict with the Soviet Union. Using it against a modern tech company seemed, at first glance, almost surreal. Critics immediately called it an overreach, accusing the government of twisting an old wartime rule to target a single firm. But others argued it was exactly the right tool for the moment. After all, China's recent actions, especially its decision to weaponize its rare earth minerals, the essential materials for making chips, batteries, and military hardware, have transformed trade into a new kind of battlefield. And in that new battlefield, Nexperia had become too risky to leave unchecked. So here's where the global power game gets even more intense. You see, China isn't sitting still either. It knows exactly how much leverage it holds over the West, especially through its near monopoly on rare earth minerals. These aren't just fancy rocks buried underground. They're the secret ingredients that make modern life possible. Without them, you can't build smartphones, electric cars, wind turbines, or even fighter jets. If China ever decided to shut the door on those exports, the impact would be devastating. The world's clean energy plans would stall, factories would go quiet, and defense industries would scramble for alternatives. But the Netherlands, surprisingly, has an ace up its sleeve, a single company powerful enough to shake the entire global tech supply chain. That company is ASML. Now, ASML doesn't make chips itself. Instead, it builds the machines that make chips, called lithography machines, and no one else on Earth can make the most advanced versions of them. Think of it like this. If the world's tech industry were a bakery, ASML wouldn't be baking the cakes. It would be the only company selling the ovens. Without those ovens, no one can bake anything. That's why the Dutch economy minister recently called ASML the crown jewel of the Netherlands. And he's not exaggerating. ASML is the largest company in the Netherlands, worth over $300 billion, making it Europe's most valuable tech company and one of the top 3 firms in the entire European Union. But ASML didn't just appear out of nowhere. Its rise to global dominance was a decades-long uphill battle filled with failures, close calls, and stubborn determination. Back in the 1970s and 80s, 2 Dutch companies, Philips and ASM International, were both exploring a cutting-edge technology called photolithography. Don't worry, the name sounds scarier than it is. In simple terms, photolithography is a process that uses ultraviolet light to etch incredibly tiny patterns onto a piece of silicon. Those patterns become the blueprint for microchips, the same way a stencil shapes a painting. But this process isn't easy. It requires mind-blowing levels of precision and some of the most advanced optics and engineering ever developed. Both Philips and ASM International quickly realized that the challenge was too big for either of them to handle alone. They needed to pool their resources, their brains, their budgets, and their courage. So in 1984, they joined forces and created a new company, ASML. The early years were brutal. ASML's first engineers worked out of makeshift offices, often pulling all-nighters to design their first functioning lithography system. Meanwhile, their Japanese rivals Canon and Nikon were miles ahead, already supplying top chip makers like TSMC and dominating the market. In 1986, ASML finally launched its first product, the PAS 2000. It was Fine, but not great. Compared to what Japan was producing, it was slower, bulkier, and less precise. The company teetered on the edge of bankruptcy more than once. What kept it alive were two lifelines: Philips' financial support and Dutch government subsidies. The government saw something the market didn't: that lithography wasn't just another business, it was a matter of national strategy. Then, after years of relentless trial and error, came the breakthrough. In 1991, ASML unveiled the PAS 5500, the machine that changed everything. It was faster, more efficient, and finally competitive. Orders started rolling in, and ASML began carving out a place in a market long dominated by Japan. Ironically, just as ASML was finding its footing, both Philips and ASM International decided to sell off most of their shares. At the time, it made sense. ASML's future was still uncertain, and both parent companies were struggling with their own challenges. But looking back now, it might go down as one of the worst business decisions in history. ASML's value today is more than 5 times that of both its parent companies combined. By the mid-1990s, ASML was finally standing tall, but it was still locked in a fierce race against Canon and Nikon. In the lithography business, there's only one number that really matters: how small you can make the features on a chip. The smaller the features, the more transistors you can fit, and the more powerful, efficient, and compact your chips become. That's why the phone in your pocket today is more powerful than a giant desktop computer from 20 years ago. All of it comes down to one thing: how finely light can carve those microscopic blueprints onto silicon. And in that race, ASML was just getting started. If you've ever heard people mention Moore's Law, you know it's that famous idea that computer chips tend to double their number of transistors every 2 years. For decades, this simple observation has defined the rhythm of technological progress: faster phones, smarter computers, and smaller devices, all thanks to engineers finding ways to cram more and more onto tiny pieces of silicon. But by the late 1990s, that progress was hitting a wall. The question for chip makers, and for companies like ASML, was simple but terrifying. How much smaller can we actually go? The only way forward was to reinvent the process from the ground up. That's where a wild new idea entered the scene: something called extreme ultraviolet lithography, or EUV. The concept actually began inside the US Department of Energy, where scientists theorized that by using shorter wavelengths of ultraviolet light, they could etch far smaller and more detailed patterns on silicon wafers. In theory, this would unlock an entirely new generation of chips, faster, more efficient, and more powerful than anything seen before. But in practice, it sounded almost impossible. To make EUV work, you'd need mirrors and lenses so precise they'd have to be flawless down to the level of individual atoms. You'd need special materials that could survive incredible heat, and software that could control every movement to a fraction of a nanometer, a distance smaller than a virus. And on top of all that, you'd have to manufacture these miracles at industrial scale, not just in a lab. ASML took on that challenge, and somehow, over the course of years of trial, error, and staggering investment, they made it happen. The result? A $100 million machine, roughly the size of a double-decker bus, made up of over 100,000 individual parts, sourced from around 5,000 different suppliers across the world. One of those suppliers, the German optics company Zeiss, made mirrors that are almost beyond human comprehension. They're so perfectly smooth that if one of them were expanded to cover the entire country of Germany, the tallest bump, the biggest mountain, would be just 1 millimeter high. These mirrors are among the flattest objects humans have ever created. And as if that weren't mind-blowing enough, the way ASML's machines actually generate EUV light borders on science fiction. Inside a vacuum chamber barely wider than a human hair, the machine fires 50,000 tiny tin droplets per second, each one no bigger than a white blood cell. Then, a high-powered laser hits each droplet twice, first to flatten it, then to superheat it into plasma. That plasma gives off EUV light, which is then reflected and focused through those near-perfect mirrors until it finally reaches the silicon wafer. Each of those light pulses helps carve impossibly small patterns, measured in nanometers, onto the chip's surface. Every layer, every transistor, every circuit starts with that dance of lasers and tin droplets. It's so intricate that even after you learn how it works, it still feels like magic. And here's the crazy part: this isn't just advanced, it's unrivaled. ASML's EUV machines are widely considered the most complex commercial devices ever built. Nothing else comes close. But ASML didn't stop there. Their engineers have already moved on to the next frontier, something called high-NA EUV, a more advanced version of the same technology. You don't need to understand the physics to get why it's special. Just look at the numbers. Each new machine sells for around $380 million, and it's so massive it weighs as much as 2 Airbus A320 airplanes combined. It takes the coordinated effort of about 100,000 people worldwide just to build one. At this point, ASML had achieved what every tech company dreams of: a true monopoly. They are the only company on Earth that can build EUV lithography machines, and every major chip maker, from TSMC to Intel to Samsung, depends on them. And that monopoly is paying off in a big way. In 2024, ASML reported over $30 billion in sales and nearly $8 billion in net income, figures that are growing at breakneck speed as the global hunger for chips explodes. In fact, the only thing holding ASML back isn't demand, it's how many machines they can physically make. So, instead of worrying about selling more, ASML is racing to expand production, building new factories, hiring thousands of engineers, and pushing the boundaries of what's technologically possible. The tiny country of the Netherlands, once seen as just a small player in the global economy, suddenly finds itself holding one of the most powerful cards in the entire tech world. Most of ASML's incredible growth is happening right where it all began, in Veldhoven, a quiet Dutch town that now finds itself at the heart of the global tech race. This is where ASML's headquarters and final assembly lines are located, the place where some of the most advanced machines on Earth are built piece by piece. But Veldhoven isn't enough anymore. ASML has exploded into a global giant with over 60 locations across 16 countries, from Europe and North America to deep into Asia. What started as a Dutch experiment has become one of the world's most essential multinational companies. Still, the Netherlands has a growing problem, one that could cost it dearly. ASML has quietly warned the government that if the region can't handle its rapid expansion, it might be forced to move its final assembly lines abroad. And that's no idle threat. Thousands of new engineers are pouring into the Netherlands from all over the world, and they all need visas, housing, schools, and infrastructure. For a small country, that's a big challenge. The Dutch government reacted fast. It announced a $3 billion urban development plan, giving the go-ahead to a brand new industrial park and an entire neighborhood designed specifically to support ASML's booming workforce. It's a modern-day version of a gold rush. Only this time, the gold is made of silicon and light. Investors are just as excited. ASML's stock is trading at around 35 times its annual earnings, a sign that Wall Street and European markets are betting on massive future growth. Everyone wants a piece of the machine that makes all other machines possible, but even titans have to watch their backs. There's always the risk of competition. Recently, Japanese researchers claim to have found a simpler and cheaper way to use EUV technology, potentially a way to bypass some of the complexity ASML has spent decades perfecting. Whether their method actually works is another story. Most experts agree that ASML is still at least 10 to 15 years ahead of anyone else, largely because they were the only company on Earth willing to bet on EUV for nearly 2 decades. And that head start isn't just technical, it's financial. ASML is now sitting on billions in profits, which means it can reinvest endlessly in research and development. So even if competitors catch up to its current technology, by that time, ASML may already be unveiling something new, possibly a breakthrough even beyond EUV. That's why most analysts believe ASML will remain the cornerstone of the modern tech industry for years to come. Every smartphone, computer, data center, and artificial intelligence system on Earth depends on chips made with ASML's machines. Without them, companies like Apple, Nvidia, and Intel wouldn't exist as we know them today. And it doesn't stop at the consumer level. The world's militaries are just as dependent. Modern defense systems, from fighter jets and tanks to missiles, satellites, and radar systems, all rely on advanced semiconductors. The US Pentagon has openly said that microchips enable virtually every military system, meaning whoever controls chip-making technology controls the future of warfare. That future is arriving faster than most people think. The US is already developing AI-driven military hardware, self-learning drones, autonomous warplanes, and robotic tanks that can make split-second battlefield decisions. By 2028, the Pentagon plans to have 1,000 unmanned warplanes ready for deployment. All of this depends on one thing: chips. And chips depend on ASML. So when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it's easy to see why ASML has become more than just a company. It's now a strategic weapon in a new kind of global conflict, one where lasers, algorithms, and light beams matter as much as missiles and soldiers. Right now, even Russia is racing to catch up in the AI-driven arms race. Reports say Moscow is developing autonomous tanks to use in Ukraine, machines that can navigate battlefields, identify targets, and make split-second decisions with minimal human input. But for any of that to work, those systems need semiconductors, and not just any chips, but the most powerful ones money can buy. That's why what happened back in 2018 turned out to be such a big deal.
If you've made it this far into the video, it means you're enjoying what we do here at Euro Bulletin. Take a second to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss more updates and insights from Europe and its partners. Let's dive in more into the subject.
That year, the Dutch government approved an export license allowing ASML to sell its EUV lithography machines to China. It was a huge step, since EUV machines are the crown jewels of chip making, the key to producing the world's most advanced processors. But the decision immediately caught the attention of Washington, D.C. At the time, Donald Trump was in the White House, and his administration had already kicked off a fierce trade war with China, slapping tariffs and restrictions on everything from steel to smartphones. So when word reached Washington that the Netherlands was planning to ship this groundbreaking technology to Beijing, alarm bells went off. The U.S. didn't want EUV technology, arguably the most advanced manufacturing tool in existence, ending up in Chinese hands, even if those machines weren't made in America. So the Trump administration sent a delegation to the Netherlands, including officials from the Department of Defense, to apply pressure directly. The message was clear: don't do it. After months of back-and-forth discussions and growing diplomatic tension, the Netherlands gave in. By 2019, the Dutch government quietly revoked ASML's export license to China before a single EUV machine ever left the country. That might have seemed like the end of it, but it was really just the beginning. When Joe Biden took office, many assumed US-China tensions would cool down. But if anything, the chip war only escalated. Washington kept up the pressure on both the Netherlands and ASML, this time targeting not just the ultra-advanced EUV machines, but also ASML's older models, known as DUV lithography systems. Normally, DUV machines weren't seen as cutting-edge anymore, but recently, new booster technologies had made it possible to use them to build surprisingly advanced chips. That was enough for Washington to step in again, warning that even these slightly older tools could give China a dangerous technological edge. After months of diplomatic negotiations, the Netherlands once again sided with the US. In 2023, it officially restricted exports of DUV machines to China as well. It wasn't an easy decision, but for the Netherlands, saying no to Washington simply wasn't an option. The reality is that the Dutch military and national security depend heavily on the United States. America is by far the largest military power in NATO, and it maintains nuclear weapons on Dutch soil as part of the alliance's shared deterrence strategy. Without US backing, the Netherlands, and much of Western Europe, would be exposed to threats from Russia and other adversaries. And the ties between the two nations go far beyond defense. Economically, they're deeply intertwined. In 2023, the Netherlands imported more than $100 billion worth of goods from the United States and exported over $50 billion back. That makes America the Netherlands' second-largest trading partner, right after Germany. China, by comparison, ranks only fourth. So from a Dutch perspective, the math was simple: better to anger Beijing than Washington. But those export bans came at a steep cost for China. By blocking ASML's sales of both EUV and advanced DUV machines, the US and its allies effectively cut off China's ability to produce the most advanced chips domestically. In one move, they froze China's progress in high-end semiconductor manufacturing, the backbone of artificial intelligence, supercomputing, and modern weapon systems. And the sanctions didn't stop there. The US also banned American chip companies like NVIDIA, AMD, Intel, and Qualcomm from selling their most powerful processors to Chinese firms. The goal was clear: slow down China's AI revolution. NVIDIA, for example, can no longer export its most advanced AI GPUs to China, the same chips used to train large language models and military-grade AI systems. The same restrictions hit other American giants like Lam Research, Applied Materials, and KLA, all key suppliers of chip-making equipment. Taken together, these moves weren't just trade policies, they were acts of economic containment. The message to Beijing was unmistakable: the era of open technology exchange was over. By the time 2022 rolled around, China found itself in a technological chokehold. One by one, its access points to the world's most advanced semiconductors were shut off. No more cutting-edge chips from NVIDIA, Intel, or AMD. No more high-end manufacturing tools from ASML. For Beijing, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a direct attempt to stall its rise as an economic and military superpower. Without next-generation semiconductors, China's tech industry would always be playing catch-up, stuck a full generation behind the US, Japan, and Europe. That was the entire point. But here's the twist: despite all those sanctions and export bans, China remained ASML's biggest customer. In 2024, nearly 29% of ASML's total revenue came from China. In some quarters, it was almost half of the company's business. How was that possible? Well, while the Netherlands had banned sales of ASML's most advanced EUV machines, the company was still allowed to sell its older DUV models, the kind used to make less sophisticated chips. And those old machines, they're still gold. Chips for cars, industrial robots, and everyday electronics don't need to be cutting edge. A microchip running your coffee machine or car's navigation system doesn't have to be made with the latest 3-nanometer process. That's why Chinese companies have been buying up ASML's older machines, stockpiling them in fear that future US sanctions might shut that door too. Ironically, those very restrictions that were meant to hurt ASML's China business actually boosted sales in the short term, as Chinese chipmakers rushed to buy whatever they could before the export window closed. But the honeymoon won't last forever. Analysts expect ASML's China sales to drop by as much as 20% 25 to 30% in 2025 as the backlog of orders runs out. Investors have already noticed. ASML's stock price has fallen 29% from its peak last summer, wiping out around $100 billion in market value. Not everyone in the Netherlands is taking this quietly. Some Dutch lawmakers have begun questioning whether the US pushed too hard, forcing the Netherlands into a trade position that might not serve its own interests. One member of parliament bluntly said, US interests are not always ours. Europe must stand up for its own companies. Even ASML's CEO has voiced frustration, asking whether the export bans are truly about national security or simply about political leverage. He's hinted that the company is losing crucial business in China, not because it wants to, but because Washington left it with no choice. Still, ASML isn't exactly cornered. The revenue it's losing in China could easily be replaced by new opportunities, right in the US and Europe. That's thanks to a massive global movement known as onshoring or reshoring, the push to bring chip manufacturing back home. After seeing how fragile global supply chains could be, Western leaders decided they didn't want to rely on foreign powers, especially not China or Taiwan, for the most critical technology in the modern world. In 2022, former U.S. President Joe Biden signed the CHIPS and Science Act, a $50 billion package designed to kickstart domestic semiconductor manufacturing, with a total of $280 billion in broader tech incentives. The results have been explosive. Since the law was introduced, companies like Intel, Global Foundries, and TSMC have announced over 90 new chip manufacturing projects across 28 states, adding up to nearly $450 billion in planned investments. And every one of those new fabs will need ASML's machines. Europe followed the same playbook. The European Union launched its own EU Chips Act, pledging around 45 billion euros, roughly the same in dollars, from public and private funds to build and expand local semiconductor plants. Germany, France, and Italy are all racing to host these new factories, trying to create their own version of Silicon Valley. So while ASML's China sales might be cooling off, the rest of the world is heating up. Demand from American and European fabs could more than make up the difference, maybe even surpass it. But the story doesn't end there. The US sanctions might have slowed China down, but they didn't stop it. Far from it. China's engineers are still producing chips, just a little less advanced. While the US and its allies are now working with 3 and 4 nanometer technologies, China is focusing on 7 to 12 nanometer chips. They're not as powerful or efficient, but they still get the job done. And that's what worries many in Washington. Because while advanced chips power AI models and smartphones, the older ones are more than enough to run autonomous weapons, drones, and AI-driven military systems. In other words, cutting China off didn't eliminate the threat. It just changed the battlefield. Of course, just because China's cut off from the world's most advanced chips doesn't mean it's standing still. In many cases, Chinese engineers have found clever ways to work around the problem. If one powerful chip can't be imported, they simply use several smaller ones together. By combining more processors, they can still achieve the performance needed for things like AI, automation, or advanced weapon systems, even if each chip is technically less capable. But that's only half the story. Sanctions themselves aren't airtight. Despite Washington's best efforts, advanced semiconductors are still slipping through. China's most powerful AI firms have reportedly smuggled thousands of high-end NVIDIA GPUs into the country through middlemen in Singapore and Malaysia. Some chips even make their way in through Hong Kong, which is supposed to be restricted from importing these GPUs, but remains one of the world's busiest trade hubs. The global semiconductor market is so vast and interconnected that policing every single shipment is nearly impossible. These shadow trade routes have become a lifeline for China's AI ambitions. And one of the reasons it now has its own homegrown large language model called DeepSeek, a direct rival to the Western AI giants. The US is constantly tightening enforcement, but as one analyst put it, it's like trying to plug holes in a ship that's still sailing. There's just no such thing as a completely waterproof ban. And while China works every angle to keep importing chips, it's also trying to build its own. The country's leading lithography firm, Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment, SME, has been racing to replicate ASML's technology. The bad news for Beijing? SME is still decades behind, roughly at the same technological level ASML was at 20 years ago. Its machines can only make chips with much larger transistors, nowhere near what's needed for cutting-edge AI or military systems. But here's where things get serious. Recently, China announced an eye-watering $37 billion investment to develop its own version of EUV lithography, the same technology that gave ASML its global monopoly. That's an enormous sum, and it signals just how far Beijing is willing to go. With enough funding and time, even the most difficult technology can eventually be copied. Some analysts now warn that ASML's head start could shrink much faster than expected. The problem is, China isn't playing fair. Alongside its legitimate research, it's also been accused of trying to steal ASML's intellectual property. The first major warning came in 2015, when ASML suffered a series of cyber attacks later traced back to Chinese sources. Hackers made off with sensitive internal data, though ASML insisted that its crown jewel, EUV technology, hadn't been compromised. But the breaches didn't stop there. In 2019, the company discovered that a US-based startup called Xtal, which was backed by Chinese investors, had stolen source code for ASML's DUV machines. The theft was carried out by former ASML employees, some of Chinese origin, who had taken the code and used it to build competing software. ASML sued and won. Xtal went bankrupt, and several people involved were found guilty of intellectual property theft. At the time, ASML tried to downplay the geopolitical angle, saying it wasn't part of a broader Chinese conspiracy. But Western intelligence agencies and major newspapers weren't convinced. They warned that China was specifically targeting ASML, and a few years later, those warnings proved right. In 2023, another Chinese employee at ASML was caught stealing data. The case is still in court, so no one knows exactly what was taken. But ASML's CEO tried to calm fears, saying the breach was comparable to one piece of a puzzle when you don't have the box. After all, each EUV machine contains over 100,000 individual components. Understanding how they all work together is almost impossible without the full picture. Still, that reassurance didn't stop eyebrows from raising when it was later revealed that the same employee had gone on to work for Huawei in China. Meanwhile, cyber attacks targeting ASML's servers have only increased, and cybersecurity experts believe most of them originate from China. The Dutch company has become a digital fortress, constantly defending itself against hackers who seem to be probing for any weakness, any backdoor, any small leak that could help China replicate what it has built. But ASML isn't alone. Dozens of other Western firms have been hit by similar attacks. According to a cybersecurity firm in Boston, China has stolen intellectual property worth trillions of dollars from around 30 multinational companies, everything from aerospace blueprints to pharmaceutical formulas. One thing is clear. This isn't just a trade war anymore. It's a battle for knowledge, a silent digital arms race fought in servers, laboratories, and boardrooms. And at the center of it all, standing like a fortress between East and West, is the Netherlands. Because whether it's through diplomacy, espionage, or economics, the new global tech war isn't being fought in Washington or Beijing. It's being fought in Veldhoven, where a single company holds the keys to the future. So here we are, a small country at the heart of a global showdown, where the tiniest chips have become the biggest weapons. The Netherlands never asked to be the center of a new Cold War, yet its most valuable company now sits at the intersection of technology, power, and politics. The question is, how long can it stay there? If China succeeds in catching up, will ASML's 20-year lead vanish overnight? Or will the West double down, locking its technologies even tighter behind sanctions and alliances? And if Beijing truly masters EUV on its own, what happens then? A new balance of power, or an entirely new front in a digital arms race? Could the next world conflict be fought not with tanks and missiles, but with algorithms and light beams, each side battling for control of microscopic circuits smaller than a red blood cell? And what about the rest of us? Will we still be the ones driving the innovation, or merely the ones caught between two superpowers, watching the future being rewritten one chip at a time? Because as the lines between commerce and conflict blur, and as nations race to dominate the machines that think for us, one thing becomes harder and harder to ignore. The fight for semiconductors isn't just about technology anymore. It's about who controls tomorrow.